we are delighted to be with Winslow Myers, who is an educator and an art historian and a practicing artist and a teacher of many things, and a great writer. And he will, I think what's particularly wonderful about this talk is that he knew Walter Murch. And so we're gonna, without any more delay, turn this over to Winslow, but I'm gonna ask you all to mute. I'm gonna mute you all, and later on you'll all have a chance to ask questions. If you wanna write them in the chat as we go along, I'll monitor the chat and we can use that, or if you just later on want to raise your hand, we'll make sure that any questions or comments or thoughts get exchanged at the end of Winslow's talk. So I'm going to now mute you all, and we will turn this right over to Winslow.
Great, thank you.
I think Winslow got muted along with the rest of us.
Oh, I know it. Winslow, you got to unmute yourself here.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Great. Well, thank you, Jayne. Very good to be with all of you. It's my pleasure to talk about Walter Tandy Murch on the occasion of the release last Tuesday of a 324-page oversized monograph, Surpassing All My Dreams, illustrating a large selection of Murch's paintings, drawings, and commissions. So I'll talk a little bit about how the book came to be, and then mostly about Murch's work. And then at the end, a little bit about his influence on me as an artist, leaving time for questions, I hope. So since this presentation is originating in Maine, I'm going to start with Murch's Maine connections, which are not super great, but they're there. Back in the 1940s, he and his family would rent a summer cottage in the Five Islands area. This painting, I believe, was probably done from a snapshot. It's a very early one, and it is called Eclipse. It's that light of the eclipse. And it probably was, the place is probably Old Orchard Beach. In addition, at the end of his life, Murch was an artist in residence at the Skowhegan School of Art. And while he was there, he painted his largest painting called Air Filter. And this gives you an idea, we'll look at it again later, but this gives you an idea of the scale of the painting. In this photograph is Murch's son on the right, who is much more famous than Murch is. And his name is Walter too. And then on the left is his grandson, who's also named Walter. And both of these people figure into they're crucial to the making of our book. This gorgeous drawing, mixed media drawing, was also done at Skowhegan. These two examples are already enough to demonstrate that Murch was not an artist tied to any specific geography, but aspired in his work to timelessness and placelessness, although his entire career unfolded in Manhattan, culminating at a historical moment when New York, no longer Paris, had become the center of the so-called art world. So a little background on my connection to Murch and how the book came about. Boston University wouldn't admit me to their master's program without requiring me to take all the undergraduate studio courses in order to learn the fundamentals. And I'm very grateful for that, even though it took me an extra 4 years working at night to pay my tuition. Also, Boston University had girls, which was a major improvement over my first undergraduate college. So already I was a little older than my classmates at BU, so I tended to hang out with the grad students, and I quickly learned about Murch, who was the head of graduate painting. In 1966, a group of us went down to see his final exhibition at the Betty Parsons Gallery in New York, and we were blown away. This was art that seemed to leap beyond the usual categorical separations like abstraction versus representation. And I scraped together the funds and bought this drawing from the show, which in my judgment is one of the most beautiful drawings made in the 20th century. What it shows is a capitol from a building that was torn down in the process of doing the Massachusetts Turnpike, which was a road that Murch took often as he drove up from Manhattan to Boston to meet his classes. A close look at the top of the Capitol reveals what looks like a 50s car from the side. The front is the curve on the right and the back, the curve on the left. It's subtle, but it's definitely there. Things like this happen a lot in a lot of Murches, almost as if he was especially good at harnessing the full powers of both his conscious and unconscious mind. So a year before I would have begun to work much more closely with Murch on the graduate level, he suddenly died while he was giving a talk in Manhattan to raise funds for the Skowhegan School. He was a 2-pack-a-day man, and in addition, he often used spray varnish in his small, unventilated studio space, which we now know is not good for overall health. So when I visited his widow, Catherine Murch, in New York in 1968, I tentatively proposed to her the idea of a proper monograph of her late husband's work. That was 53 years ago. Like her husband, she was an extraordinarily sharp and graceful person, and she said very gently to me, "We'll just have to find exactly the right people for that," which was an elegant way to protect her husband's reputation while at the same time not discouraging me. Over the next 30 or 40 years, I tried to use my contacts in the New York art world to see if I could find the right people to produce a big book of color reproductions, which of course was not an inexpensive proposition. Plenty of people in the galleries, museums, publishing houses, and foundations knew all about Murch and admired him, but they wouldn't bite. Finally, the stars aligned a few years ago. You may have heard of Murch's son, the bearded man in the photo of Air Filter, who is an Oscar-winning editor of films like The English Patient, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and more recently, the documentary Coup 53 about the 1953 overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran. He had a long-term working friendship with George Lucas of Star Wars fame, and Lucas happens to own a very large collection of Murch paintings. So everything came together, and after another few years of scholarly work, we have a book that does justice to the art. It's not as if Murch was unknown when I began trying to get this monograph into print, and I could choose many examples. Judy Collishan, a Manhattan curator and terrific scholar of Murch, who was indispensable to our book, had put on a beautiful show of Murch paintings at the Whitney Museum at Philip Morris. A few years ago, I was sick in bed, and just to pass the time, I went onto the websites of as many prestigious museums as I could find here and abroad to search for works by Murch. And it was amazing how many turned up. And our indefatigable researcher, Deb Thompson, found many more. It was almost as if Murch was famously dispersed across many museums and at the same time not as well known to the general public as someone like Jackson Pollock, who was in his gallery. So one mission of our book is to correct this odd condition. And I know a lot of artists who can't wait to see the book. When he was my teacher, a major retrospective of 75 of his works was touring American and Canadian museums. The catalog for that exhibition, which I'm showing you now, had a wonderful essay by Matthew Robbins of the Museum of the Rhode Island School of Design, who organized the show. But the reproductions are small, black and white, and blurry. In any case, the color reproduction of art has come a long way in half a century. Meanwhile, Murch's son had done something extraordinary for his father that turned out to be very helpful for our book. He took a color set of 4x5 color prints of all the pieces in the original 1967 retrospective and put these prints into refrigerated storage. So after half a century, this file became invaluable to us because Murch's grandson, the younger fellow standing on the other side of Air Filter, digitized the prints, and this gave us the ability to publish images of paintings of which we don't even know the owners after all this time. We'll look again at that painting. Murch was born in Toronto in 1907. And if you've been to Canada, you know how distinct it is from the US. It's quieter, it's less frenetic, it's more European, especially Quebec, Montreal. People on average tend to have better manners than we Americans do. Murch's father owned a small chain of jewelry shops, which somehow fits when you look at his many precise images of clock mechanisms. The practice back at the beginning of the 20th century, if you were born left-handed, as Murch was, involved tying the offending hand back behind the infant. We now know that this can be a cause of stammering, and that is indeed what happened to Murch. When I knew him, it was still faintly there in his manner of speaking. To top it off, a football accident in his teens left him almost totally blind in one eye. His mother, who lived to be 101 and could stand on her head in her 90s, was a singer and accompanist. Murch and his brothers all played instruments, and Murch himself was good enough to play the violin on the radio. But his general shyness and perhaps his stammer made him uncertain about a career in the performing arts. His mother suggested, "Why not try art school, Walter?" And with this desultory question began one of the most dedicated art careers on record. This painting, illustrating an article on the physics of violins, was done around 1962, the last of about 16 covers he painted for Scientific American magazine. Maybe you even remember some of them. The artist wrote about how a painting could give off a kind of vibration, and his son thoroughly explores the painter's interest in sound in our book. Sound became crucial for his son's own career as a legendary sound designer and later film editor. He received an Oscar, the son did, for the haunting, phantasmal sound design of the film Apocalypse Now. This painting was one of Murch's last commissioned works done for Vogue magazine, though it was never published by Vogue. And they presumably supplied all the silver objects and left Murch free to do what he wanted with them. A painting does seem to give off an almost audible crystalline vibration. Anyway, Murch completely took to art school and finished 3 years of rigorous academic training up there in Canada. Some of his teachers were members of the group of 7 Canadian landscape artists. And he learned to work very hard, and he never forgot how to work hard. In 1927, he took a summer job in Manhattan, and by the end of the summer, he decided to stay, supporting himself for a time working in a stained glass factory. He met his future wife, who was also a Canadian and the daughter of missionaries, because they both lived in the dorms of Christodora House, a kind of dormitory for young people who had recently moved to New York and were in need of temporary housing. At one point, the as yet unmarried couple were on the ferry to Brooklyn. They were standing apart, having had a little spat over a rival's interest in Catherine. But a couple of drunks began to bother her, so Walter intervened. When the couple disembarked in Manhattan, they had to run through the ominous Gaslight District on their way back to Christodora House. The two drunks, joined by a third, followed and caught up with him and beat him to a bloody pulp and left him for dead. Catherine managed to get him back into her dorm room and ministered to his wounds, and they were married 6 months later. Murch's Canadian training, this photograph is when he was about 55, had been fiercely academic, where the idea was you were supposed to be able to render a subject with clarity and completeness. But he broadened his point of view by taking classes at the Art Students League, and by far his most important teacher was the painter Arshile Gorky, who showed him the importance of letting the medium take over and come alive, a lesson Murch took very much to heart. Gorky, of course, was a seminal influence on many action painters, especially de Kooning. Gorky and Murch would go to museums and galleries together. This Gorky painting in particular seems to me to have an affinity with Murch's work in the general sense that it feels like a nocturnal landscape of the mind. Murch's still lives also have that feeling that we are looking into the mind of the painter. Murch only became an American citizen in 1948, and so he was not able to partake in the projects for artists that the Roosevelt administration offered under the auspices of the Works Progress Administration to help get artists through the hard times of the Depression. Instead, he gratefully took jobs which included endless, meaningless window arrangements for Lord and Taylor, murals for hotel lobbies, and advertising work, for which he eventually began to win prizes. None of the mural-sized projects survives as far as we know, though Judy Collishan's research has provided a few tantalizing photographs like this one. Danny Robbins tells a wonderful story about his retrospective catalog. Murch had been hired by Vincent Astor and Serge Obolensky in the late 1930s to execute wall murals in the Russian room of the St. Regis Hotel. I would love to see these. Robbins continues, Murch conceived a running pattern of dark blue and bursts of white and gold built in forms of horses, sleighs, soldiers in uniform, Russian fur hats, cockades, fashionable ladies. He worked for over 2 months painting in oil on immense loose pieces of canvas and was hardly finished when the Russians marched into Finland. Consequently, Murch had to change the Russian room into the Hawaiian room, and an equally vast and expendable version of Diamond Head, palm trees, water, and surfboarders. This is not only poignantly funny, but it also indicates that Murch was perfectly capable of working on a large scale in his privately made art if he so chose, but he preferred to stay easel-sized. This old phonograph, this painting is now in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum, meant a lot to him in terms of his musical upbringing. So he posed it like Vermeer on a rug, an Oriental rug. His son recounts in our book that the area where the Murches lived near Columbia University operated on DC current for many years, hence the wind-up Victrola. In 1941, Murch had his first exhibit with the legendary gallerist Betty Parsons. The critics were rough on him, and it was 5 years before he showed again. When he was discouraged, he would go to the museum like the Metropolitan, say to himself as he walked by, masterwork after masterwork, he's dead and he's dead and he's dead. But the Betty Parsons connection connected him to one of the nerve centers of the avant-garde in New York by bringing him into contact with action painters like Pollock, Clifford Still, and Franz Klein. Klein once even said that he thought Murch would be the artist who would be most remembered in the distant future. Murch admired the way Pollock let the paint have a life of its own, just as Gorky had suggested, and also the way Pollock created a work of art in the act of making it. And here's Murch working in his studio. He gradually evolved a remarkable process that suited him. It began with looking at humble objects by the light of a naked floodlight bulb, almost always working at night. He set up these objects to the left of his easel so that he could view them with his good eye. Invariably, in the 400 or so paintings and drawings that he left, the light comes down at an angle from the left. He spoke of the floodlight as his son. Sitting in a straight chair caused back problems, so he used rocking chairs, rocking away to look and rocking back up to add more paint. Smoking and listening to radio jockeys like Gene Shepard as he painted through the night. He wore out 3 of these rockers. Picasso spoke of paintings as being a horde of destructions. Something liberating happened to Murch when he began to do things like disassemble that phonograph he had already painted, resting on a rug, and painted the machine inside it. Perhaps the destruction of the machine and the exposure of its innards was like looking more deeply inside himself. But he adopted an additional important process to destruction or destruction creation, which was to leave his surfaces, canvas or drawing paper, in the hallway of his Manhattan apartment so that he and his family would walk on them, or even leave half-finished drawings out on the fire escape in the rain or to get help from the pigeons. These unusual procedures destroyed what was to him the frightening black whiteness of surfaces, and as he said, started something that he could continue. He would also leave pieces of canvas under his easel where splatters of paint could land on them. The marks, scuffs, and drips, even the rings of paint cans became essential to getting the painting or drawing started. He felt he needed to paint the object in front of him, but also, like his action painter friends, he needed to apply paint unself-consciously so that something surprising might happen. The dynamic contrasts he worked up between, on the one hand, using drips or a rag or palette knife just to put down pure paint, and on the other hand, precisely describing mechanical objects and such, enveloped in a palpable atmosphere, became a kind of quiet drama that allows us to see the painting as a painting and not an illustration of whatever motif he chose. It was quite remarkable to find a way of making art that integrates opposites as far apart as Vermeer and Pollock. Here's the painting that he was standing on. There are some unexpected things going on here that add interest. Murch had an impish sense of humor and admired Marcel Duchamp, who also made deadpan mechanical objects that commented on sexuality. About every 2 or 3 years, Betty Parsons would give him a show, so we always had that deadline to come up against. Given that he was doing commercial commissions at the same time, his work ethic is almost beyond comprehension. If that wasn't enough, he began also to take teaching positions, about which he said, quote, "It's a curious thing to be a teacher. I think you have to be a teacher for at least 10 years before you know what is taking place. That you really aren't teaching at all. You just exist, stand there, and they see you as an example. They use you as a sort of person to bounce their ideas on. And they say to you, am I all right? And they, in fact, teach themselves. The things that are done in the first half hour, it almost makes me weep. I mean, beautiful things, but they don't know how to carry on. They're afraid, immature. If I had one message, I would say, go ahead, it must be done," unquote. So this way of teaching was very different from someone with an academic axe to grind, and Of course, ironically, it made him a fantastic teacher. He chose to think of his students as having the capacity to make art pretty much from the beginning, art which involved skill but went beyond skill to visionary excitement. And this worked very well at Boston University because the art school was a kind of boot camp for skill building. He was uncannily good at saying just the thing to students that might loosen them up and help them grow, not only as artists, but as whole people. He once pointed his finger in my chest and said emphatically, "Stop suffering," which was good advice for me at the time. He would even take a student work, an unfinished one, and keep it in his office for a few days, demonstrating his interest and affirmation. So poets and scientists often do their most creative work when young, but painters can continue to grow in their work into old age. There are many examples like Titian and Goya and Braque. Given that Murch died at the relatively young age of 60, late is a relative term. The point is he was growing right up until he died and would undoubtedly have made even more remarkable paintings had he lived. The arc of great artists' careers as they gradually find strength to explore further is fascinating to witness. When it's all neatly packaged in a book, it looks relatively easy and almost inevitable in retrospect, but of course, it's not all that way in the life lived. Here's a comparison between a lock, the inside of a door lock that was done in 1948 and one that was done in 1965. You can see that he's developed a way to work with atmosphere that's become very subtle and effective. He told his son that taking apart these old locks had the excitement that archaeologists felt opening a tomb. The writings of Albert Camus impressed Murch enough that he references Camus in one of his short statements, which I'm going to read. The factors that influence a person's life influence the painter and his paintings. The choice a painter makes when a painting is to be made, the effort to paint the secret behind human beings and things. I must not paint the thing itself, but I will paint the air between myself and the thing and beyond. Of course, I accept composition and the fact that the painting will come from paint itself. The lesson of Camus is that no artist can live without reality, but he, the artist, does not tolerate it. I will accept and reject, be logical and illogical. To create, I will recreate. This statement has always intrigued me greatly, and as I was writing my contribution to the book, I was interested in the statement and getting more deeply into how Murch thought. I think Camus' untimely death in a car crash was the greatest possible loss of a public intellectual. I so wish he was around today. Anyway, I tracked down the text of a talk that Camus gave at a university in Norway a few days after he received a Nobel in 1957. And within that talk is about a page that's worth a listen, because I think it's very relevant to Murch's art. So this is Camus. On the ridge where the great artist moves forward, every step is an adventure, an extreme risk. In that risk, however, and only there, lies the freedom of art. Art, in a sense, is a revolt against everything fleeting and unfinished in the world. Consequently, its only aim is to give another form to a reality that it is nevertheless forced to preserve as the source of its emotion. Art is neither the complete rejection nor complete acceptance of what is. It is simultaneously rejection and acceptance. And this is why it must be a perpetually renewed wrenching apart. The artist constantly lives in such a state of ambiguity. incapable of negating the real and yet eternally bound to question it in its eternally unfinished aspects. In order to paint a still life, there must be a confrontation and mutual adjustment between a painter and an apple. And if forms are nothing without the world's lighting, they in turn add to that lighting. The real universe, which by its radiance calls forth bodies and statues, receives from them at the same time a second light that determines the light from the sky. Consequently, great style lies midway between the artist and his object. End quote. That's very profound and probably, it's taken me years. It's still find it difficult to understand and comprehend, but I think it's totally relevant to Murch, and I think Murch found it deeply confirming. So there are painters like Picasso who are all over the map, and painters like Murch who push in a single direction and triumph with that. The primary issue with Murch was how to paint the air between myself and the object and beyond. Camus' confrontation and mutual adjustment between the painter and an apple. The landscape painter Neil Welliver said he wished he had a tube of air that could help him recreate the atmosphere of a landscape. Welliver got the illusion of air with exact and sophisticated combinations of non-natural color. Murch did it with subtle glazes, and it took a lot of time and trial and error to make it all work. You may have noticed that in most of the work, there are the objects, usually on a shelf, but sometimes hanging on a wall. With the shelf format, there's a beyond that Murch mentions when he says, I'll paint the air between myself and the object and beyond. But exactly where is this beyond? Compositionally, it's integrated into the painting by means of a low-key color. So you don't see the object or objects, you see the painting as a whole, or at least that's what Murch hopes. But this beyond remains ambiguous. How far back is it? For me, it is as close as the picture plane. So it wavers between being seen as the painting surface itself, something you can reach out and touch, and as a shallow, ambiguous space made more real by the atmospheric spatiality of the forms in front. This is called Transformer. It's probably about 4 feet high. The beyond here is less ambiguous, where something like, as in the bowler hat on the cover of our book, where this transformer is hanging in front of us vertically. It's hanging on a wall, but if the wall is the surface of the painting, then the hanging object projects in front of the picture plane, comes out at us, which is quite a feat for a painter with only one good eye. Murch admired poets like Wallace Stevens, in part because he liked the ambiguity and playfulness in Stevens' work. He once told his son that paintings with overt messages are like wooden chairs with metal screws. Eventually, the metal screws work their way out and the chair collapses. Camus agrees with this when he asserts that great art is beyond not only the frivolity of the merely decorative, but also beyond propaganda, recalling what Cecil B. DeMille once said, if you want to send a message, call Western Union. Instead, what Murch intended was to try to make us see that ordinary things are really extraordinary if perceived with the eye of a visionary. He spoke of wanting to break that automatic, habitual way we take reality for granted without really experiencing its miraculous quality. And around 1960, his work began to open up and take off in that regard. Actually, this is 1957, I think, and it's a car heater. You have no idea, if you get a chance to see the actual objects, how junky they are compared to what he turns them into in the paintings. What counts is the choices that Murch makes as he transformed them. It was not easy. Once a couple of grad students, Earl Fector and Reg Case, called on Murch in his studio at Skowhegan when he was working on that painting Air Filter. And they found him in a kind of stupefied trance, very un-Canadian. And they were walking back, they walked back to the house where Murch and his wife were staying. And from inside, she called out, "What's the matter, Walter? Couldn't you take it?" There's little traditional perspective to these works. They're not naturalistic or realistic paintings at all, nor are they in the least like any other paintings, past or present, except with faint echoes of the painters Murch admired, especially the French painter, still life painter Chardin, touches of Vermeer, certainly Pollock, Jasper Johns, whom Murch knew. Murch clearly absorbed the lessons of action painting, meaning that paint is given its freedom purely as paint. There are a lot of accidents, thrown paint, drip paint, put to good use to strengthen the whole. The interesting thing about this painting, I don't know whether you can see it or not, but right about 2/3 of the way from left to right, there's a faint line running down the painting. And he actually was well into the painting, left part of the painting, the left 2/3 of the painting, when he added on another couple of feet and sewed I don't know how he did it. I mean, glued the painting down to a hard backing. And you can kind of see why he did it, because that grapefruit was kind of too much in the middle of the earlier version of the painting. Anyway, it was very successful. It's funny, just yesterday, I did the same thing with a portrait that I'm working on, where I didn't like the placement of the people in the painting, and I had extra canvas on it, so I was able to add about 3 inches on the left side, and it looks wonderful now. This is a meteor, a stone. It's called Meteor. Here's an incredible painting of a little broken doll. The painting itself is about 4 feet high, and you can see in the upper right a ring from a paint can. This was actually done on 2 separate pieces of plywood that Murch glued together. It's a powerful image of almost a comment on us as human beings. Murch was reading the plays of Harold Pinter when he was working on this painting. And here is Air Filter, his largest painting, the one I showed you at the beginning, the one that the graduate students happened upon him working. It's an air filter from an old car, and the graduate students noticed that this piece of drapery that looks like a spiritualized piece of drapery, for lack of a better way to put it, was just an old T-shirt hanging on a mantelpiece. And this very simple but extraordinary painting of a loaf of bread. And Murch was asked what he intended in making this painting, and he was open about it. He said, "I wanted to make a miraculous loaf of bread." And the person said, "Do you think you succeeded?" And he said, "I have no idea." And this painting of again, using the Vermeer motif of an Oriental rug. This one is called Broken Rock, about 4 feet high. And this painting called Two Doors, again, quite large, that you saw him working on in the photo I showed you from his studio. There are the doors, and you can see they're actually have screening in the middle of them. This is Murch's studio with the shade up. Murch said that he didn't like to paint people because they stared back at him. This self-portrait was done because the Manhattan dealer Lawrence Fleischman commissioned a series of self-portraits from artists. It has the typical self-portrait stare that is hard to avoid if you're trying to observe yourself closely. I heard somewhere that he wasn't too happy with this, but it's good to have. His approach to drawing was very interesting. He went to an old hotel in New Hampshire and saw all this wallpaper peeling off the walls. And the instant he saw this wallpaper, he said he knew he could make a drawing. And he began to think about drawings as paintings. This mixed media drawing is actually done on old wallpaper. And he would use anything to, obviously well, maybe not obviously, but this drawing of a melon, which is in the collection of the Whitney, he probably kind of rumpled up the paper and then put it in water and stretched it out again and worked on this, so that the melon is kind of there and not there. He would use chalk and charcoal and ink spray and anything that helped. He was asked to, a number of artists, 15 artists were asked to pick a poem and not illustrate it, but make an accompanying drawing. And Murch picked a poem called The Glass of Water by Wallace Stevens. I don't have time to read it to you right now, but when you read the poem, you can see that this was a good job of not illustrating it, but complementing it. It's a mixed media drawing, and Art in America liked Murch's drawing so much as they put it on the cover. And lo and behold, there's a beautiful echo between the A's in the Art in America and the general pyramidal composition of the drawing. It's a beautiful drawing. So at the same time that he was moving ahead with his private work and his teaching, he was doing commissions for various corporations, or cover art for Scientific American or Fortune magazine. And because he took these commissions as an opportunity to learn and gain strength, they not only fed into his private work, but they're cherished by collectors almost as much as his private work. This is a 1947 cover of Fortune magazine called Fine Chemicals. Another cover of Fortune illustrating this greatest year for glass. I'm not sure whether this was a cover for Scientific American, maybe. And here's an extraordinary image of Abraham Lincoln, clearly taken from the statue in the Lincoln Memorial, I guess, done for Look magazine. I'm gonna go back for a minute. He once said to me that he thought it might be 500 years before he was understood. And I was floored by his saying this to me, because he was such a modest person and so generally self-effacing. But after he died, the scholar Judy Collishan found this note in his studio, quote, "For me, there seems to be no end of wonderful work. There is a release in my mind which makes it clear how I can paint with complete release, get under control, to paint without any reservations, as if you knew how life could be 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 years from now. One may as well paint as you really would like to. That is the important thing. Some of the work hints at this quality, so there is really no limit to what you can do. Miracle, unquote. To me, this reads like the statement of a very fulfilled person, a person who knows he's given his utmost and has really accomplished something completely outside of time-bound fashionable trends. He once defined art as, quote, the manufacture of a completely useless thing. Of course, as a great artist, his example was extremely useful to me. And I know many other artists who revere Murch's work and also think of it as a kind of high bar to try to live up to. These common, unprepossessing objects, rocks and loaves of bread, and blocks and plastic dolls and bowler hats, are enlarged and raised up before us as if on an altar and painted as if they were hymns to the mystical glory of God. He said that the paintings don't mean a thing, but meaning is the metal screw in the wooden chair anyway. The important thing is not that they mean, it's that they live. They give us an experience. They're not mere expressions of exhibitionistic skill like so many works of art, but a willingness to explore a connection to something larger. There's much more in our book, including a generous foreword by George Lucas, a rich and detailed reminiscence by the artist's son, scholarly essay that puts Murch in context by Judy Collishan, the premier scholar of Murch's work, and an appraisal by the distinguished critic and curator Rob Storr. The researcher Deb Thompson, the editor Andrea Denise, and the designer David Skolkin all did a beautiful job. Our book was definitely a team effort of the best kind. So I'll finish up by saying a few words about the direct and indirect influence of Murch's work on my own painting. One part of learning to paint and draw for me was to consciously imitate Murch, which I did for a while I was still in art school. As we know, that was a perfectly legitimate way, in fact, the accepted way to learn how to paint during the Renaissance, to copy the master. Today, of course, originality is prized and we must all find our own way. This drawing I did on the left of an upside down piano leg and a sail on the right are clearly imitations, as closely as I could do in a way, from around the late 60s, just after Murch died. And this was a painting I did in conscious imitation of him. But obviously I had to get away, and I wrenched myself away with the first painting I did to get away from him. This is about 78 inches tall, so it's bigger than anything he ever did. And it's a subject that he never would have done. My father and me and my future wife on my father's boat. Nonetheless, over the years, Murch's effect on me was too powerful to prevent some of his motifs from getting into my work. For example, in this diptych, I found myself taking inspiration in the folds of the sail on the left from Murch's exquisite sense of form and the pieces of drapery that often hang over the front of his shelves. And this painting by Murch was one of the Scientific American covers. A couple of decades ago, I saw it for sale in New York Gallery for $26,000, which is one of the reasons it's nice to have a copy of the book on my living room table, because owning an original Murch has become completely out of reach. Anyway, in this diptych, there's certainly a strong echo of the kind of subject matter that may have crept in. When I was in Hawaii, I photographed this microwave tower, and clearly the circularity, the abstract circularity of it echoes Murch's similar use in circular shapes. And in this recent painting, though I honestly wasn't thinking of Murch at all when I painted it, I'm willing to admit his influence may persist in the geometry of the forms. I suppose the equivalent for me of Murch's commission work would be my portraits. I enjoy these because I find it much simpler to concentrate on pleasing the customer than pleasing myself in my private work, which is a much more complicated thing. So the cover, the bowler hat, is Murch's last painting. Last time I checked, there were 3 copies of the book at Sherman's bookstore in the new releases section.